If you hear echo, then shut that down. Because I don't hear it. But maybe put your volume down as well besides the mute. Okay. Okay, so I first like to thank Esther for doing the logistics.
Yeah.
And making this all work out. Thank you, here. I'm very thankful and happy that you're all here. And Jewish time with traffic on Island, people that will let me trip again. So we will try not to be distracted by the door opening and closing. And the order of business will be that we'll speak a little bit about the memorial about Schwartzy, myself, my uncle, and then Brother Gershon will give us his presentation on this topic tonight. Why God, why? And then we'll follow up with some questions by myself and of course from you as well. And we hope to be done at 8:45. And if we go long, we go a little bit longer, but the main thing is that I want to get back to the sushi. So most of my family is in Israel because my father's yard site was Friday. And I was holding back over here and hanging out here in Los Angeles, which was mostly in San Francisco because I had a simcha. My wife's sister, who's a shluchim in San Francisco, they had their first son have a bar mitzvah. So we were in San Francisco for the weekend, and I came back this morning at 4 a.m. Wow. So when you have 6 kids, it's really not a big deal, right? So that's that. So mazel tov for them. And I decided that my father would want me to participate in a simcha of a bar mitzvah over a memorial. And in any event, I plan on going in 2 weeks to visit my father's grave in Sfat in 2 weeks with my son. So that's my game plan. It is the 6th yard site, the 6th memorial. And I figured 2 things. What better way to commemorate it than to have my own blood uncle, Gershon Schusterman, who knew my father longer than myself. I'm 47 years old. You knew my dad.
Probably 58, 59, 60, who can, I can't count, but something like that.
So they really go back, and I'll let my uncle Gershon share a little bit about that. And it works. Bashartness has it that Rabbi Schusterman just came out with this incredible book, which I read. I'm continuing to read, and it's a heavy topic, an important topic, and a topic that I don't think begins and ends in one night. I don't think it begins and ends after you read a book. I think it's somewhat of a lifetime process. I think that is for me. No one can just give me a pill and say, Schwartzy died, it's all for good reason, and suck it up. It's sort of a process, and it could be a lifetime of a process. But again, that topic is not my topic, that is your topic, and we'll see how you unpackage that. But I felt that it's just so apropos, so bashart, that it's you being here tonight and you discussing your book on Schwartzy's yard site. So again, I want to thank all of you for coming. It means a lot to me. I want to thank all of you 15, 20 people on Zoom right now for tapping in, for zooming in. And so without further ado, I hand over the Zoom microphone to Rabbi Gershon Schusterman. Thank you for joining us. And after the class, after the talk, I will figure out how to take your money to purchase a book, and the rabbi will actually sign it if you purchase it tonight. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Shalom Aleichem.
Aleichem Shalom.
Tech support. Schwartzy was my brother-in-law. I don't know how it works out when the connecting parts of the brother-in-lawhood move on independently. If you have, in our family, we've had, I guess, different families have different challenges. And my kids lost their mother at a very young age. My youngest twins were 16 months old when their mother passed away. The oldest was 14. So they have their own trauma and their own Black humor. And so do we adults. So my wife and Olivia, who are Schwartzy's wife after Mendel's mother passed away, and my wife, Hannah Rachel, who is my wife after my first wife, Rochalea, who was Alta Schwartz, Mendel's mother's sister. When they both passed away, we both eventually remarried. And what is their relationship to each other? So we call them sisters-in-law twice removed. You have to have a black humor, sense of humor, but it works. Okay, having said that, Schwartzy was cool. You have to, if there ever was such a thing as a cool chassid, that was Schwartzy. He had a very real, sincere, serious side, but he tried to cover it up with being cool on the surface. And with that surface, he reached out to how did he call it? Any Jew that moves. He was totally non-judgmental because he saw their goodness and their neshama, and he was attractive because he saw the good in them. Schwartzy liked to learn Torah. Interestingly enough, he was doing so many things on the outside. Usually the people who are out there, but Torah is a nice thing, but who has time for that? He liked to learn. He learned. And at a certain point, I used to live in Long Beach. Schwartzy lived in, I followed him through the various houses from the early 70s until he passed away. So he said, we have to learn. I said, okay, you come to me. So he says, no, you come to me. So I had a membership. There was another thing that passed away called an airline. It was called TWA. Some of you might still remember the name. And I had a membership in the TWA. What do they call that? The
Frequent Flyer.
The Frequent Flyer Club. In those days, I was flying a lot, and that was one of the things I had. I can get in any time, and it was before 9/11, so it was easy to get into the airport. So we at least once a month, and sometimes more, he would drive south from LA, and I would drive north from Long Beach. We would meet at TWA Frequent Flyer Club. We'd spend an hour learning some Hasidus. We drank seltzer because we both had to drive back home. And that was how we connected. We did that for a few years. It was really, really nice. But, we shared over the years many simchas, sad events, and the saddest event that we shared was the untimely passing of the 6-year rate. And some things in life, they seem 6 years, it feels like yesterday, and then on the other hand, it feels like so long ago, and it's like an optical illusion. All right, be that as it may, Schwartzy was lovable. Schwartzy left a legacy of Avas Yisrael and of concern, and that is probably one of the most important things that a rabbi can do. He can teach Torah, and he did teach Torah, but he gave people a sense that they are important to God and that God wants something from them too, and to do it with joy. And that, in a nutshell, is my little 6-year eulogy for my friend Schwartzy. They have a lichtige Gan Eden. My story began April 13th, 1986. So unlike some people who read some of the publicity, I got condolence letters. 1986 was 36 and a half years ago. So don't give me any condolences, but a loss of the type that losses don't disappear. They remain. Hopefully they heal, but they don't disappear. Certain pains that we have, we think they're over, and then when the weather changes and there's humidity or there's a storm, certain pains come back. Even scars sometimes have their pains. So the loss of a wife, she at the age of 36, I was 38 then, doesn't disappear, but we move on, and we have moved on, being anchored at times in the past, especially when you have 11 children. 11 children, to suddenly lose your wife totally unexpectedly, and all of a sudden, your role as a father now becomes the role of a mother too. And I had a job running a school, running the Hebrew Academy in Orange County in Huntington Beach. That itself was a 12 to 16 hour a day job. And I needed to figure out how to get at least another 8 hours into my every 24 hours. I didn't achieve that. And eventually, after a few years, I realized that I can get someone to take over my role at the Hebrew Academy, but I couldn't get someone to take over my role in my home. So I opted for my family and helped the transition to a new director. And then went through a challenging period of trying to figure out how to remain balanced, because when you lose a wife suddenly, it's like half of your being is amputated and you're out of balance. It's hard to have a sense of normalcy. It's not just that you're hurting, it's you question your own, who you are. And I had rabbinic teachings. I found I sought out a therapist who had herself lost her husband at the age of 40 and had raised children herself. I figured maybe she would be the right person. She lived in Westwood. She was already retired by then, but some of people who knew her and knew me took her out of retirement, at least for one more client. And I spent a half a year going to see her every second week from Long Beach. And here we are. I have been an Orthodox Jew since I was born and raised. And I went to yeshiva. I went through the whole rabbinic system. And I had a lot of answers to the big existential questions, such as why do bad things happen to good people? But let me tell you, as you can all understand, it's one thing to know ideas in the abstract. It's something completely different when you have to know them in the concrete. I had to test myself, does the philosophical answers, do they work in reality? And that took years of work, and I describe some of that in the book. I never gave up my faith. In fact, I don't want to get too dramatic about the events of that day, but one thing I can tell you is that shortly after the doctor told me that my wife is no longer with us, I said to myself that now is my opportunity and my challenge to put everything that I've believed in all my life, everything that I've preached all my life, 38 years, but now I'm a little older than that, but that was a good chunk of life. I have comforted mourners. I have dealt with people with tragedy. I've said the right thing, but now I have to try it out. Does that work for me too? So I said to myself, this is God's challenge to me. can I live up to everything that I believe? Where will this leave me? And it was a years of process to try to figure it out, and hopefully I passed the test. Running a school in 1986, we had close to 400 students in the Hebrew Academy. The parent body was not necessarily Orthodox. They were Jewish, but their level of knowledge and their level of observance was like average Orange County. That's what they were. But they had known my wife very well. The rabbis, we were very friendly and warm and intimate with the parent body. The school was a good school. The kids loved their teachers. I recently found out that one of the students at the Hebrew Academy, who I remember the family when they joined up, they ended up having 7 boys. And they weren't even Orthodox at that point. But the oldest son, recently, through Meisha's father-in-law in Florida, there was a bride who spent the weekend with her fiance, but Jewish modesty means that she slept in somebody else's house. That's how the tradition requires it. And they slept by an old friend of mine, and he was talking to her, and what's your name? Her name is Rachaleah, which is the name of my first wife. And I thought, yeah, and who are you? He knew that. He said, who are you named after? I'm named after my father's 2nd grade teacher.
Wow.
And he has an older daughter who was named after a relative, but he said to himself, and I called him up I tracked him down in Maryland. I called him up, and I had actually moved from Maryland to Boca Raton. Yes, I always wanted to memorialize her, and when the right time came, I named my daughter for her. So they were close to my wife, and they were close to us, and they were close to the entire school. It was almost like one large family. And they were challenged. These rabbis are preaching, God takes care of us, everything is good, God is good. Well, how does this work that the mother of 11 children, the 2nd grade teacher, dies suddenly like that, just like that? And she passed away in April. So in the end of July and August, I gave a lecture series to the parent body on the subject, paraphrasing the name of Rabbi Kushner's book, When Do Bad Things Happen to Good People? His book is When Bad Things Happen to Good People, or Why Do Bad Things Happen to... I put it in a question, but that lecture series, which I still have a transcript of those lectures, this book, I can't say the book came from that lecture series, but everything that was in the lecture series is in the book. What was added is because there's a big difference from someone who writes a book in a crisis and he's 38 years old, or someone who is closer to twice to 38 and has lived a lot more life and become a lot more seasoned. Had I written the book at 38 or at 39 or at 40, it would be a completely different book and it wouldn't resonate with people. Mendel said it's a tough book, it's a hard book. Well, it is a tough subject, but the book, as challenging as the subject is, I can vouch the book is very readable. And as you will see if you so choose to get one. Okay. Rabbi Kushner, who was a conservative rabbi, wrote the book in 1981. It was a bestseller, still around on the market. You can buy it on Amazon. When Bad Things Happen to Good People, he had a simple answer, very simple answer. God doesn't control everything in the world. There are pockets of evil that God, it's outside of his control. So God is sympathetic for our losses, but you can't blame him because after all, it's not in his control. I don't know how people found that book comforting, how people can find that idea comforting, even though obviously many people did. If not, it wouldn't have sold. It wouldn't have been a bestseller. But one thing for sure, that flies in the face of established religion in general, any of the basic religions, and certainly in relation to Judaism. Our God is in control of everything. We do understand him. We don't understand him. We'll get into that a little bit soon. But he is in control. To say that God is not in control of evil, then we should get rid of the phrase, thank God. Because if he's not in control of evil, why do we give him credit for good? I can get into this, but I don't want to get on a theological tangent. So yes, we believe God is in charge, and I believe Kushner is wrong. And you'll have to, if you read the book, you'll make your decisions whose point is better. I was looking for applied answers. And those are philosophical answers I knew. I was looking for applied answers. I have to tell you, today there are a number of books from a traditional Orthodox perspective that are on the market. Then there was not one. And I said to myself, someone ought to write a book to debunk Kushner and to tell the full story about why God allows bad things to happen to good people. Well, I waited 35, 36 years and I wrote the book. And you'll see it, decide if it was worth the time. But let's talk a little bit about the question, why do bad things happen to good people? First, let me tell you a little true anecdote, which will set the tone for what I want to say. I have a son, his name is Eliyahu. He's a little older than you remember. He's a little older.
Atlanta.
Huh?
Atlanta.
In Atlanta. He's a Chabad rabbi in Atlanta. I was visiting him about 12 years ago. Must have been some family simcha. I don't remember what it was. And he says, Tati, can we go out in the evening, just you and I, and just talk? I said, yeah, that's why I came. You know, we have a simcha, but you know, you're my son. Now you're a big rabbi, and I want to have the good old-fashioned relationship that we've had before. Okay, so we went out to a quiet place, and he gets onto a tirade against God. His first cousin, Levi Deitch, in Tyson Corner, Virginia, who was a little bit younger than him, was at the last months of his battle with lung cancer. He had a wife, 4 children, and Eliyahu, he was a jovial guy, this Levi, happy. He was a fighter in his illness. He was loved by his community. And with me, why does God allow this to happen to his wife, to his children? And, you know, he had to get things off his chest, and he got it off his chest. And I was but he was starting, the question was why? And I said, you know, I have the answers. I'm the rabbi, right? I'm his father, so I know more than him, right? Right. As I get ready in my mind to focus in on the answer, I said to myself, you know, anything that I'm going to say, he knows already. He has said it already. He counsels people the same way I do. What am I going to say to him? Something that he already knows? And then God was kind to me, and I had a flash, and I said, Eliyahu, do you want an answer or do you want a hug? I was shocked at what came out of my mouth. He was shocked at what he heard. And he paused for a moment, his eyes filled with tears, and he said, Tati, I want a hug. And I gave him a hug like I haven't given him since he was 6 years old. And after that, he didn't have any more questions. Because there wasn't a question here. This was a rhetorical question. He knew as I knew, and I knew as he knew, and we knew as you all know. We don't have answers for this. If anybody came here thinking, I'm going to give the definitive answer why bad things happen to good people, give them their money back. There are some good cocktail lounges on Melrose, not too far. Enjoy yourself with the money that you get back. The reality is, we don't have answers in any specific loss, not to the individual loss who loses again, there are normal losses. A parent who dies on their deathbed at the age of 90 after having lived a full, rich life is sad, but it's not a tragedy. But when events happen, it doesn't have to be death, when things happen out of context and out of the normal way, an early death, an unexpected death, a why, there is where the why comes up. And I'm going to try to deal with the why, defining the question why. I'll tell you an anecdote about Eli Wiesel that I heard from Shlomo Schwartz. Wiesel was at UCLA once lecturing, and Eli Wiesel had only one topic that he lectured on, which was the Holocaust. And where was God during the Holocaust? And he went through his trauma. He wrote books. He has a book called Night and a book called Day, I think, which went a few years. One was written in the late 40s or early 50s when he was going through a doubtful stage. And then when he sort of returned, he struggled with that and put his struggles into words. So he was lecturing on this, and he was one young guy who was brash and said, "But where was God? But where was God?" And Wiesel ignored him. But he kept asking, persistent. Finally, Wiesel's patience plots, and he says, "And if I gave you an answer, will that make things good?" So that's point number one. If we had an answer, will that resolve the problem? Not at all. So we need to ask ourselves what we mean when we say why. Another time, this I heard from Manis Friedman. I don't hang out with Eli Wiesel. I don't know if they may have hung out with him. It was a similar setting. People were asking why, and he was ignoring the question. It was the middle of his lecture. They were interrupting him. And finally, he turns to the guy challenging him and says, "I have the answer, but I can't tell you." The guy says, "Why can't you tell me? This is such an important question. If you have the answer, why are you not going to tell me the answer?" And he looks him straight in the eye and says, "If I gave you the answer, you would be a Nazi." And the whole room became silent. And Eli Wiesel didn't explain it, but what he meant by that is, if there is an answer that would rationalize the Holocaust, then the Nazis rationalized the Holocaust. They perpetrated the Holocaust. So we have to stay away from logic that would justify things that should not be justified by human beings. That's what he meant. If I gave you the answer that would rationalize, and rationalize means justify. And if I can rationalize and justify the Holocaust, then in effect, you may not act out as a Nazi, but theoretically, inside, you would have Nazi-like values. And one more side to the question, what do we mean when we ask why? If we had an answer to why people suffer, then we would be complacent to people's suffering. As long as we have built into ourselves an aversion to tragedy, to loss that doesn't make any sense, that is a catalyst for us, each one in his own way, to do something to alleviate suffering. People die from cancer, give money to the American Cancer Association. You know, all the organizations that are working for making the world a better place come from people who support it because they don't want the world, they want that problem to be eradicated from the world. There was, in a hospital, not far from one of the treatment rooms, there was a woman yelling in pain. And her family was just outside the door and just kibitzing with each other, just talking. They were laughing, they were making jokes. And this guy was walking by and says, how can you just stand there so complacently? Don't you hear the cries? And they said, yeah. Do you not realize that this is the maternity ward when she's having a baby? This story may or may not have ever happened, but the point is, if you can find purpose and meaning and justification for suffering, you can kibitz around it and be cavalier about it. The part of us that the bile rises and say, why do bad things happen to good people? That is the way God set the world up, so that we will carry some responsibility to alleviate those problems. The Jewish approach is that God is in charge. And whatever God does is for a purpose. When we had prophets, the prophets warned us in advance what might happen. And if the people didn't shape up, they did happen. And then we knew what God's plan was. We don't have prophets today. We can only work with the values that are in the Torah and the books of the prophets, that they teach us some of those values. But they don't necessarily give us answers to the why. But what we do know is that God is in charge. If God is in charge, we are not victims. We have agency, and we get to choose how to react. Many of you may have heard the name Viktor Frankl. He was actually technically a neurologist and a psychiatrist from Vienna. And he was also in Auschwitz during World War II, suffered a lot, lost his most or almost all of his family. And one day, when he was lying in his little room, they stripped him naked. He was hungry, he was thirsty, he was naked, he was as miserable as a person can be. And that's where he came up with his concept of logotherapy, which is the name for his philosophy. And I'm going to give you one quote from him. He said, he wrote about this in his book. Between stimulus and response, there's a space. In that space lies our freedom and our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and happiness. He said, the last freedom that cannot be taken away from you is your attitude towards what is happening to you. You can choose to say, well, life is bad, life is tough, and I am a victim. And the path of victimhood doesn't lead to anywhere positive. Or you can say, I don't know why, but I have the freedom to choose my attitude. And as an individual, historically, no nation on earth has suffered as much as we, the Jewish people. The first exile of the Jewish people was in Egypt. They were in Egypt for 210 years. 70 of those years were years of labor. They built I don't know if they built the pyramids, they built the cities of Pithom and Ramses, if you study the book of Exodus. That exile, that period, was told to Abraham when Abraham was, this is all straight from the Bible, no commentary, just facts, when he was 70 years old. And God told him that your children will be enslaved in Israel. Over there, the Bible says 400 years. It was in fact 210 years. And here's where the scholars go in. How do you reconcile 400 with 210? We'll leave that for if you can't sleep about that, call me up and I'll explain you how they worked out the numbers. Why Isaac wasn't born yet? There was no Jewish people. All that existed was Abraham and Sarah. And God is telling Moses, we're making a covenant and it's going to be good at the end. But meanwhile, be aware that your descendants who aren't even in existence yet will be enslaved for 210 years, 70 of them hard labor. That's a good beginning. Certainly, we know from that wasn't for punishment because there was no one to punish. It was, so our destiny and for the struggle of the Jewish struggle is sadly legendary. We've been through this. And hundreds, maybe thousands of books have been written about our history and the suffering that we have gone through. And we don't necessarily have answers. However, one thing factually is true. If we would have taken the role of being victims, we would have gone the way of so many other much more powerful nations that are remembered in history books, but they don't exist today. We exist. We exist as a vibrant Jewish people. Part of it is because God, as Talmud says, one lamb among 70 wolves, and the shepherd keeps an eye out for them. We are the lamb, the 70 wolves are the nations that have oppressed us and pogromed us and killed us and murdered us and raped us. And we tell ourselves this is some great cosmic plan, which we don't understand. We don't necessarily appreciate it, but we accept that this is God's plan for us. And here we are, talking about it, celebrating Israel, celebrating the Pesach, Shavuot, Sukkot, throughout our struggle, battered and bruised, but we're here. And that just as it is about the Jewish people and the Jewish nation, it's also about the individual. If you see yourself as a victim, the path will lead you to depression and to nothing productive. If you say, this is a challenge from God, I don't know why, but I have agency. And as Viktor Frankl said, we have the freedom to choose our attitude in dealing with that. Then we brush ourselves off, we pick ourselves up, and we rebuild. The Jews who, yes, we lost 6 million in the Holocaust, but those who made it out of the Holocaust and came to the free world, they built the state of Israel. There's many of them here in Los Angeles who ended up being successful and wealthy and healthy and had children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. They saw the devil in their own eyes, and they were not perturbed, and they started again. Or as they say in the 12-step program, things don't happen to us, things happen for us. We can grow from that, and we have grown from that. Ultimately, there's a lovable God out there that we can appreciate. And there's also our recognition that God himself or herself, even in modern times, God is genderless, so I don't mind saying God himself or herself in his essence is unknowable. So there are times that we know him and we can appreciate him and we can appreciate his goodness. And other events we have to submit and say, God, we pay homage to you, but we don't understand you, but we accept, you've kept us going. There's a purpose for all this. Who was it that said, Groucho Marx said, any club that would have me as a member, I wouldn't want to join. A Hasidic master said, a God who limits himself to things that people can appreciate is not much of a God. The question might be reversed. Why in the world should little people, we individually, and even collectively, we're just little human beings. God is the creator. Why do we think that there's a little arrogance or in thinking we should know the mind of God? We can't. And the Talmud talks about Rabbi Akiva, who was put to death by the Romans in the most cruel way. And Moses asked God, and the angels asked God, is this what the greatest Rabbi Akiva, is this how his life comes to an end? And God said, be silent. This is what entered my mind. Now, can I tell you how many interpretations of that phrase exist? Many, many. But it's not something that, hey, suddenly the Holocaust happened. Rabbi Akiva's death in the cruel way that it happened, and he was the greatest rabbi of his generation who taught 24,000 students. There's a realization that there are, and the Talmud says it bluntly, as frustrated as we are when we study that and say, what does that mean? But that's the answer. We don't know. God is unknowable, and yet the same. It's like a parent. Have you ever experienced this in a supermarket, like Ralph's or Vons? There's a mother walking down the aisle with her little kid, and then he passed the candy aisle, and the kid grabs the candy off the shelf, and the mother says, no, you have to put it back. But I want it. No, I want it. And finally the mother takes it from him or her and puts it back, and the kid says, Mommy, I hate you. Ever heard that? I have 11 kids. I know how many times I've heard that. Sometimes mommy, sometimes daddy, and however it works out. And then 3 minutes later, the kid falls down and bruises themselves and runs to mommy, and mommy hugs the kid and embraces the kid, and the kid embraces mommy, and the world is good again. Many of the people who allegedly lost their faith after the Holocaust are simple, normal human beings who are so traumatized that the trauma doesn't allow them to, their anger at God, which in many ways is justified. They're not great rabbis, they're normal human beings. I just read a terrible story, yeah, I can get long-winded. A story about, it was a PBS show, and I just watched the show. It was 9 minutes, but I read it before. And the person who went to the Lubavitcher Yeshiva, and I saw a clip of them playing in front of the yeshiva, the Bedford and Dean, where I went to. He was probably in yeshiva in the 50s, the same time that I was. And his father remained very faithful. His mother remained very observant, but she had a big chip on her shoulder to God, because when they got off the train coming to Auschwitz, they had a little baby, and the minute they got off the train, somebody went over to them, not somebody they knew. A woman went over to them and says, "You have to separate from your baby. If you're going to hold on to your baby, you will both end up in the same place. Give me the baby and you will live." And before she can say anything, somebody else came and grabbed the baby away from her. Can you think of anything more traumatic than that? I can't. And that woman would have a grudge against God, pretty much justified. But she remained observant and was frustrated. Probably a couple of good years of therapy for that kind of trauma would help a little bit, but not a lot. Anyway, bottom line is, we're here, and we're here positively. We're here because we roll with the punches and pick ourselves up and live to celebrate another day and having another generation and another future. And it's funny, we believe in God. God promised us a lot of sorrows, a lot of tragedies. He also promised us that in the end of days, Mashiach will come and we will reach a new world order where God will be supreme, and we will have a vision and an insight into what God's plan was. May that be speedily in our day.
Okay. Rabbi, thank you. I'm going to cozy up with my uncle here. Thank you. I have nothing to add. Am I in? Okay. I have nothing to add. I just have one, not even a question. I just want to, something I was looking from the book, and maybe I glossed over it. To me, I categorize, let's say, why do bad things happen to good people in two, like Roman numeral 1, Roman numeral 2. What I mean is, I just want you to tell me if I'm right or wrong. And what I mean is car accidents, Holocausts, people missing, a plane coming down from the sky, things like that. For the most part, these were caused by humans. These were bad humans, these were bad people. Someone was drunk and he killed somebody else, DUI. They made some very poor choices, bad choices, evil choices like the Holocaust. But at the end of the day, God didn't make that choice. The humans, those Nazis, those people, the car driver, they made that very bad choice. And as a result, something bad happened.
So when I ask a question, it's not on God. I'm sad, I'm mad, I can be angry, but to me, it's not a religious question. Because it's the human that caused that tragic event to happen. So when my father was 65 years old and he got into a car accident, it was the other driver's fault, it was Schwartz's fault, but that's a human issue. So there was no, to me, God didn't come into the conversation. But when he was 68 and he had cancer, that's when I started looking at God. Why did this happen? And I asked God that question. Or let's say the rabbi that you mentioned in Tyson, Virginia, Levi Deitch, who had cancer at a young age, who had lung cancer, who never smoked a cigarette in his life. Why did God do that? There I was able to ask the question on God. So that's what I mean. I'm trying to make a distinction in my own brain to work things out. Or if let's say someone snatches a car stereo from my car, I'm not going to look up to God for that. It's the person that did that. I won't blame God for that. So is that fair to make these distinctions in my brain where there's human error or human evil or human terrorism versus when God is directly involved, whether it's, a tornado, the tsunamis, and things or cancer or people dying at a young age with 11 children. Is that fair to make that distinction?
Yeah, you're categorizing it, but I don't know if I buy your categories, I would ask the question just the opposite way. Why would God allow an evil person to shorten somebody else's life? So we had in Chumash recently, a very interesting story. Joseph was sold into slavery by his brothers, and he was put into a pit, and then he was sold to the Ishmaelites, and they sold him to the Midianites, and then he ended up in prison, and he was falsely accused of trying to have his way with his master's wife in where he was working, and he was put into prison. And at the end, he ended up interpreting Pharaoh's dream and became the viceroy to Pharaoh, and the rest is history. When Jacob died, the brothers said, now Joseph is going to get even with us. Our dad is gone. He had respect for dad, so he didn't do anything, but now he's going to get even with us. And they made up another story saying that father said that you should forgive us. And Joseph said, whether he believed them or not, he said, this was all part of a divine plan from the beginning. Everything was part of the divine plan, where I should end up. And you see it, in this case, it had a happy ending. So I don't bear you any grudges to his brothers. If a murderer kills somebody, the Jewish attitude is that person's life was destined to end anyway. The murderer was the tool that he was an unauthorized tool, and therefore he should be incarcerated and go through the legal system and be locked up or put to death. So I have a bigger problem with where people thwart other people's lives than if it comes like from God. Now, the reality is, this is a philosophical point for a moment. If we expect God to intervene in the Holocaust, then God is going to be pretty busy all the time on Highland, on Beverly, on Melrose, in Los Angeles, in San Francisco, all around the world. There are, for the person who loses a loved one in a cruel and what they perceive unjust way, that is a personal, individual Holocaust. It's not an event. It may be an event to me and to you, but to the person's brother, sister, mother, father, son, or daughter, it is a Holocaust. And if it can't be, if it can't be, the challenge of why bad things happen to good people is equal on 1 or 6 million. 6 million is obviously quantitatively different, but in terms of if you expect God to run the world, then the question has to be answered or not answered equally. And if you expect God to intervene, God long ago decided that he gives man freedom of choice. And he put shackles on himself not to intervene. He does supervise. The Talmud says that God protects us every day, but even the person to whom the protection happens is unaware of it. The story of Purim, you know the story of Purim? There are no overt miracles. God's name isn't even mentioned in the entire Megillah. And yet we see it as God orchestrated things so that the Jews should be saved from the wicked Haman. And so we have another holiday to drink and be merry. Okay.
Thank you. Good. Okay, I'll take some questions, a few questions before we conclude here, and take your time. If you have any questions, go
I
ahead,
just
Esther.
want to say, based on what you were saying, if you're gonna categorize the bad, then you can also categorize the good, and we don't. Like if somebody, leaves a quarter, leaves your meter full, you don't say, oh, I'm so happy about that person. You think, I always thank God, like, oh my God, thank you for making this meter full. So you can kind of equalize it for the good and the bad, where it's Hashem doing everything.
That's good. Yes, Jane. Thank you.
So, from what I've read in the comment, so I could be wrong here. So getting angry at Hashem is a bad thing. That's a outcome you really can't do. Because it's like saying that what he did was wrong and we have no way of knowing that. But we do have anger when bad things happen. So what's the best way to channel that anger? How do you deal with that? I mean, that emotion that, otherwise, I mean, you have to direct it somewhere, no?
Very good question. And
I got a bug book.
Rabbi Zelda Redmo.
chapter 5, the title is It Okay to Be Angry with God? It starts on page 93 and ends on page 120. That's dealt with in some great detail. The reality is the Talmud, yes, your question is very real. You articulated it well. Where does the anger go? Where should it go? And the reality of the Talmud says a person is not held culpable for anger and even blasphemy said in a time of tragedy. In other words, God knows that man has that weakness because he's human. And not everybody is a philosopher. Ultimately, the answer is for a person to have a faith-based relationship with God. But see yourself as the kid who says, Mommy, I hate you, but doesn't really hate Mommy, but is angry that they don't have the candy, and is ready to be embraced by the Mommy again almost immediately. Broaden that to adults and broaden that to real life. That is the answer, if that is an answer. You know what I mean?
Go ahead, Sal.
Correct me if I'm wrong, Reverend Mendel, but based on your question about man-made source versus God-made source, from my understanding is that God gives us free will as being the answer to your question that you presented to Rev Gershon. Is that not correct? Or
He gives us free will, and thus,
and because he gives us free will, that's why things are as they are in terms of man-made source.
Yes, that's what I was saying. So why, right? That's what I was saying. Why direct anger to God? You blame it on the person. God gave every human free will, and they have the right to steal a stereo from my car at night or not.
And there's a reason why he gives us free will.
Yeah, but free will is one of those big paradoxes. Ever since there was free will, there was always the paradox about free will. Yes, I have the free will. Was it Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes says that your free will to swing your arm stops where my nose, where it ends at my nose, and if you keep going, I'll punch you back. The point is that you have free will to do good or evil. You have free will to hurt me. But where is God? Where do I fit in to your free will? And the answer, as Joseph said it in a positive way, it was God's plan to get me to where I am now. Not all stories end up, not all victims end up viceroys of Egypt. A lot of people end up damaged and hurt. But we see it as a divine plan. Right here on Los Angeles, on Oakwood and Beverly, not more than 5 or 6 years ago, one morning at 6:35, one of the members of our synagogue hit an older man who was 86 years who was going to shul. I don't want to go into all the details, and he was killed. The person who was accompanying him was in the hospital for 3 months. While that family was sitting Shiva on Detroit, Rabbi Lando, they sent a message to the driver saying, we see this as part of God's plan. Don't ruin your life because of this. Lest you think that this is people who are out of touch with reality, this is a basic traditional Orthodox perspective. They were tested to have to bring you down to real life, but they didn't sit in their Shiva house miserable and angry and saying, this irresponsible young man. He was, the police did an investigation and he was exonerated. He wasn't considered guilty, but nevertheless, I don't know how he's dealt with his guilt, but bottom line is, from a godly perspective, that man went through which concentration camp, I don't know, and came out intact and raised a family, and that's how he ended his life. We don't understand. When you open your eyes and you look around, there's a lot more tsaros than you realize. Clergymen know that, churches know that, and judges in court know that.
You had it, yeah, Nina, go ahead.
So like, just like as you're saying, things are happening all the time, right? Good things, bad things, like things happen. Things have happened, things will happen. We go through one trauma, that's not the end of trauma. Another one will happen. The question is, at least for me, is how do you move forward with meaning? How do you find the meaning? To you say like you roll with punches and you move forward with positivity. But when there's that void of like that relationship of faith, how do you find the meaning?
Okay,
And strength.
your question is all too real. It's a very real question, that what you're asking.
Like, what's it for, right? What do we?
So the question is not, see, first thing is to recognize that the event that happened was purposeful was planned by God, possibly before that person was even born. When a person dies in a tragedy at the age of 40, that person's lifespan was preordained. It could have been through cancer, it could have been a car accident, it could have been a murder, it could have been who knows what. So if you have a outlook at life that God is involved in planning our lives, that doesn't explain it, but that gives you a framework that there's a purpose here. Then, again, oversimplifying it, but going back to my simplistic analogy of the child and the mother's embrace. Mommy was good to this child for the 3 or 4 years until she suddenly became cruel and didn't let him have a candy. And the child lost it for 3 minutes and found it again when the person got bruised, the child got bruised. In God's plan, the void, and I like that void because I use that word in the book on this very, very subject. The void, that the emptiness, that the place of the damage, of the loss, of whatever the issue is that is causing the upheaval in the person, that void is filled with the realization, needs to be filled and could be filled with the realization that this is a purposeful event from God. The child didn't understand why he can't take the candy. We understand, but the child didn't understand. There's a lot more that we don't understand about events that happen to us than we do understand. We appreciate the good things that happen, but we don't appreciate the bad things that happen. But if we have a relationship with God, and if we can, and this doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen by reading a book. It has to do with a Weltanschauung, an outlook at life, and a lifestyle that nurtures the realization that God is active in our lives. And we invite God into our lives. In America, American Jews invite God in for life cycle events. As I heard from Schwartzy, births, weddings, and funerals. And he says, in case you forget that, we call it hatching, matching, and dispatching. But joking aside, that's not where God exists. God is not a formal God that visits like an uncle or an aunt that comes to visit once every few years. God wants to live in our lives. God wants us to invite him into our homes all the time. Friday night, Shabbos, kosher, Tuesday, people who have that relationship with God are not at all immune from tragedy, but they have a framework with which to integrate it. The emptiness is filled with, as a good phrase, we say it in davening every day, Imoy Anochi B'tzara. God says, I am with him in his travail, in his suffering. Now, that can also, another paradox. If God is the planner for the tragedy, and then he's comforting me by being, I am supporting you in your tragedy. In the book, your aunt, have you heard the book?
No.
Yeah, your aunt is represented in the book, Rachel. And she told me that when she came down with multiple sclerosis when she was in her early 20s. And I told her to pray, and she said, God gave me this thing and I should pray to him. You know, she had a legitimate point. But at the end of the day, the answer, if to the extent that I can put words to answer your question, Judaism is not, a mosaic. Doesn't make any sense if you just look at random panels of the mosaic. When the mosaic is complete, then you see what the picture is. You have random panels. It's just, what is that? It's like a puzzle that's half done. The relationship with God needs to be deeper and broader, and then it kicks in and it works.
Okay, thank you. I think we'll, okay, last question. Go ahead.
Question is that I went through a lot of personal tragedy. I lost my wife and I had a lot of health issues. But I ended up here. I was living somewhere else. I ended up here and I got with my Jewish community